Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Gaylord National Harbor for the Navy League's annual Sea Aerospace Conference and Trade Show, the #1 gathering of U.S. Navy leaders and indeed international Navy leaders here to talk about strategy, budgets, technology, and more. Our coverage here is sponsored by GE Marine, Huntington Ingalls Industries, and Leonardo DRS, and it's our honor to have with us our very first guest, Brian McGrath, a navalist of the First Order, a retired United States Navy commander, surface warfare officer, and the founder of the Ferrybridge Group. You consult and advise companies, but also the senior Navy leadership. Brian, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Talk to us a little bit about where we are now, right? I mean, the Navy leadership, one of the more important things is it's almost the second anniversary of the first of 2 accidents that claimed the lives of 18 sailors. Many, many lessons learned, a lot of implementation. First, before we get to like sort of bigger strategic topics, where do you grade the Navy, where the Navy is in this process of improving its surface warfare, operating, navigating, and just skills in general?
That's a good question. The fiscal year 20 budget reflects a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of energy by the Vice Chief, Admiral Moran, by Admiral Brown at Surface Forces. Those two men and their team have spent a good deal of time ensuring that surface warriors get the training they need, that the training fidelity is increased, the simulators are better than they used to be, that the simulators integrate both bridge operations and CIC, the Combat Information Center operations. If you go back to the reports from the accidents, you see that there were problems in that integration. I would give the Navy an A on its response to those accidents. What I would give a C is the process, and it's only because I'm frustrated. I'm a man in a hurry, and it takes time. It takes time to fund things. It takes time to bring people on contracts. It takes time to build buildings, to bring the capability to bear, and I want it faster. And so I would like to see it happen faster. It's hard for that to happen the way we allocate money in our system.
Do you think that from an account, people were talking about accountability, the Navy did bring charges, but those charges were dropped. From an accountability standpoint, I know there's been a robust debate about whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision. From your standpoint, has there been enough accountability in the wake of these 2 incidents?
I'm satisfied. I think I wish I could have an easy to follow understanding of the logic behind how different people were held accountable. I have some problems with some of that, but by and large, the people most responsible for those accidents were held accountable, both on Fitzgerald and on McCain. I think the CNO had an institutional interest in protecting this concept of command and the centrality of command in the surface force and the submarine force in the Navy. And in his defense of the centrality of command, I think he probably went over the line. In fact, a judge found that he did, in terms of influencing the judicial proceedings, which ultimately I think led to some of the judicial proceedings being truncated and the captain of the Fitzgeralds moving on. I think for the interests of the Navy and the nation, that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing.
Where did you see the inconsistencies from your standpoint in terms of how accountability was applied?
There was a lack of 4-star accountability. The operational commitments that were driving the reduction in maintenance and the reduction in training time and the use of certification, the certification system sliding to the right in some cases. All of those operational commitments, they weren't made up by the captain of the ship. They weren't made up by the strike group commander. They weren't made up by the numbered fleet commander. They were coming from the Pacific Fleet commander and the PACOM commander. And I haven't seen any, they seem to have escaped all notice in this process. And I think that's unfortunate.
And are you satisfied with just the overall plan to get back to a higher level of professionalism, seamanship, and warfighting skills that the Navy has committed to in the wake of both of the reports and all of the corrective actions that have been laid out?
I am satisfied that a number of very good steps have been taken. When I was in command, I used to tell my crew, we're going to do it over and over and over again until it's perfect, and then we're going to do it perfectly over and over and over again. I tell you that only to tell you that I am never satisfied, and I don't think anyone should ever be satisfied, because satisfaction brings contentment, contentment brings a lack of attention. So I think you'll see a continuing approach from the Surface Force and from Navy leadership that shows that they are not satisfied.
And just to note, you were a commanding officer of Bulkley, and you guys did some very tremendous work for which you were recognized. You were mentioned in dispatches, as the saying goes. What more would you do? What more do you think the Navy should do at a time of great power competition to be really ready for the kind of competition that the Surface Force has not really seen since World War II?
Things that I see them doing. Putting more energetic and capable missiles on ships. I'd like to see those energetic and capable missiles find their way onto amphibious ships also. I'd like to see the big deck amphibs get some kind of a medium altitude, long endurance ISR platform that could then also fly off of cruisers, destroyers, and frigates and LCSs to fill in what I think is a giant hole in the ISR architecture that supports the employment of those energetic and long-range weapons. I am satisfied that the sort of professionalism stuff is getting the attention it deserves. I'm satisfied that the pieces and parts of the architecture are getting attention. What I'm not satisfied is getting the attention because I don't know that anyone has the job or is empowered to do so. What I don't think is getting the attention is the architectural approach to how it all fits together. What are the capabilities that we need? How are those capabilities linked? What are the comm paths? What's the quality of service? What's the latency required for that information to move from one thing to another? That kind of systems architecture at a grand level is something I don't know that I don't think the Navy is organized to accomplish. And if it were organized to do that kind of systems engineering, the acquisition world isn't aligned to acquire such a system if it were created.
Let's talk a little bit about that design from the Navy's standpoint. Admiral Kilby is going into that job of, in the N9 job. Admiral Murr is obviously going to 7th Fleet. Admiral Kilby has been one of the confidants with the CNO to help build this kind of digital fleet architecture plan. We know that Hondo Gertz, the Navy acquisition executive, has been working hard to sort of speed acquisition. The MQ-25 program held up as an example, the unmanned tanker for the future fleet. What do you think is wrong and not working as well as it should so that the Navy can get to that place where it can build better these architectures and capabilities for the future?
For one thing, Kilby's one of the smartest guys I know, and there is nobody in the Navy better positioned to work on this stuff than Jim Kilby. But Kilby owns the air platforms, the surface ships, and the submarine capabilities. He doesn't own the networks. He doesn't own some of the sensors. He doesn't own a large number of the over-the-horizon, non-real-time, specially compartmented intelligence kinds of things that help create a target that you could then take action against. So what we get is that Kilby's in charge of a lot of the requirements, but not all of them. When it comes to acquisition, it's even more diffused. You've got PEO IWS involved. You've got PEO C4I involved. We don't, and those people, they meet, Gertz is the first common superior. And he's not, he's a smart guy, but he can't architect this. There's got to be an organization that looks across domains and says, here are the warfighting requirements, here is how we want to allocate functionality across that architecture, and here are the performance standards we need so that then that architecture can be acquired in pieces, but in pieces that are integrated from the start. We're almost trying to imagine the architecture as the sum of the pieces, and that is ass backwards. We ought to imagine the architecture and then build the pieces.
Do you think that then the organization looks what the Navy needs is something like the Army's Futures Command, whose job it is to take that holistic structural view?
What the Navy needs is what the Navy used to have, which is a Navy Materiel Command, which was a 4-star who owned the systems commands. That would, I think, a 4-star with the kind of authority maybe that Naval Reactors has, and the kind of long-term stability in the job, a 4 to 8 year term. That kind of a person, the Navy does things really well when we put someone in charge and leave them there for a while. Hyman Rickover, Wayne, not Wayne Hughes,
Wayne Myers.
Wayne Myers, the father of Aegis, the folks involved in the submarine ballistic missile program. I'd like to see that kind of approach brought to this broad systems engineering approach. We used to do it with the Navy Materiel Command a long time ago when the problems weren't nearly as complex as they are. I think the complexity should bring something like that back.
Let me ask you two other questions, both I think somewhat biggies. The Navy and the administration in its budget proposed retiring Harry S. Truman. There was an intellectual case made that we will retire a ship 20 years before the end of its service life. However, we save $5 billion for the complex refueling overhaul, and then we save $1 billion a year in run costs on the carrier in order to be able to reapply that cost to future generation break-ahead capabilities. The Vice Chief of Naval Operations, in his confirmation hearings to become the next CNO, Bill Moran, made that case. The CNO, at a conference, made the case for sort of trade-offs. And then Vice President Pence went aboard USS Harry S. Truman and announced that the ship would, in fact, be staying in service. And we've seen other sorts of changes in plan happen from the administration's budget. Everybody understands churn in the discussion process to get to that budget. But oftentimes, when something is in the budget, it's seen as something that's in the budget unless there's, through the congressional hearing process or conference that things get pulled out. What does this do to the Navy's ability to plan when the leadership goes out and makes a case like this and then has to abruptly change course? I mean, what kind of message does that send? Because I've heard from folks on the Hill, but also people in the Navy who have expressed frustration with it.
There is a tension, there's no question about it, between the cost of the way we fight today and in the near future and the midterm future, which is represented by the carrier and the air wing. And then there is a cost associated with moving to the beyond that 10, 12, 15-year timeline. The Navy's budget has to reflect both of them. I think the decision to, first of all, there was all this talk about how the defunding the Truman refueling was a sign that the Navy was walking away from large carriers, which is idiotic when you consider that in the same budget submission they were buying 2 brand new ones.
You noticed that, did you?
Right. So the idea that the Navy's moving away, because both of those new ones would last for 50 years, right? So the time that you would get by extending the Harry S. Truman's life is inside the life cycle of the 2 ships that they bought. So let's just put that one away as a stupid, silly argument. If it's just a financial argument, that's what adults get paid to do in Washington. They get paid to make hard decisions about where to go. Presumably, adults in the Pentagon fought this out, had numbers and analysis and campaign analysis in front of them, and made a hard decision. That hard decision was then countermanded in the way that it was, number one, makes me lack confidence in the national security establishment of the United States. Number two, it's simply another reflection of the kind of White House leadership that we have had thus far on matters like this. I don't see a tight coupling between the president, his national security strategy, and the Pentagon, mostly because I don't think the president understands his own national security strategy. That's a problem. It's a problem everybody has to work through. I want my uniformed military people to continue to keep their heads down, to continue to salute, to continue to do what they have to do. But it's my job and the job of people like me to come out and say it's wrong and it's happening and it's dangerous, and it degrades the American people's confidence in our ability to do our job.
You have been critical of the president and the administration in terms of potentially behavior being reflected at lower ranks, and then I just want to ask you a little bit about that, and then go to unmanned, which I know you want to talk about.
All right. Listen, the president is going to do what he does. He's going to act like he does. It's obvious, it should have been obvious for the last 4 years, that he will not change who he is. That does not relieve chiefs, first classes, lieutenants, captains, admirals from continuing to do what they know is right, to continue to insist on the highest levels of probity and good behavior from the people that work for them, and to continue to insist that they set a good example for this country. There is no other way for this system to work, and I urge everybody wearing the uniform to continue to do what they know is right.
Let me ask you about unmanned systems. We're now really at a cusp of bigger, more active, more autonomous, more significant capability going into the unmanned force, to the point where the Navy leadership is looking at counting these against ship numbers. I know that discussion is ongoing. But when you look at unmanned underwater vehicles, these are things that are conventional submarine-sized vehicles. If you look at unmanned surface vessels, these are going to be significantly sized platforms with considerable legs and durability, range and persistence. Talk to us, and then a whole bunch of other systems like Wave Glider, for example, that constitute a surface battle network. Talk to us a little bit about how the Navy has to look at how to integrate this proliferation of unmanned systems, going all the way from Triton and other kinds of overhead assets to sea surface assets to subsurface assets, to build that kind of network architecture that can operate in denied, contested environments.
All right, so when I talked to you earlier about the Navy's lack of an organization who can think broadly about architecting that level of multi-domain warfare across both the GenSur and the SCI level, or the combat system stuff and the non-real-time stuff, that plays out in this unmanned systems debate. When I left the Pentagon in 2008, the platform people, the ship guy, the submarine guy, the air guy, they were all getting criticized that they weren't moving fast enough toward unmanned, that they were protecting their rice bowls, and that they were afraid of putting people out of jobs, and there was all this talk about how they were moving too slowly. 11 years later, all three domains are moving quickly in unmanned. And the money is moving in those directions, and I am very happy with some of the first moves. Now, what would be helpful is if we were acquiring those unmanned systems from a set of requirements derived of a coherent architecture that said, I have this unmanned undersea vehicle, and it's going to do these jobs, and that in order to do these jobs, I need this data to move this fast to these locations. I need the same kind of fidelity on the information coming from the MQ-4 Triton, or from the MQ-25 Stingray, or from the large USV or the medium USV that the Surface Force has in their budgets. We don't have that kind of architectural fidelity that tells manufacturers, here's what we need. Instead, we have smart people saying, this is what we think we'll need. It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference nonetheless, and the difference is cost. Ultimately, in order for the manufacturers to be able to meet that fat, or that margin that comes from not having a coherent architecture, they have to factor in cost, and that makes systems more expensive. But if you're able to tell a manufacturer, to a fare thee well, what we need from your widget, they can do that in a more cost-effective way.
Let me ask you one last question, because that triggered thinking about the 355 ship fleet. Obviously that's a goal, although the Navy is now reconsidering its new sort of digital fleet architecture and what that's going to mean for the future. But the Navy is looking back to bring mothballed cruisers back into service, retain older destroyers in service. That's going to mean greater manpower operating, as well as sustainment costs. And the yards, private and public, are straining now to support a much smaller fleet, much less a much bigger fleet. Are you comfortable and confident as the Navy looks to bring more assets back in service to try to gain that capacity back, that ultimately it's going to be a bill that the Navy's not going to be able to support, especially if, as everybody suspects, the good budget years are 1 or 2 more years and may not span 10 years forward as some people would like it to be?
The repair, modernization, and sustainment industrial base is insufficient to meet the needs of a much larger fleet that is being planned. There's no doubt in my mind. That industrial base, they're publicly held companies. They have requirements to their stockholders, and because they don't have confidence that the United States is going to actually sustain the investment in a larger Navy over the long haul, that's why they don't build out their workforces. That's why they don't invest more than they do in technology. They're trying their very best to keep people working, to make a fair profit, and to do a good job for the government. But when the government says, "Hey, we're gonna build up from 285 to 355 ships, isn't this going to be great?" I need to see the stuff in the budget that says we're going to pay for a lot of people. We're going to pay for more modernization money. We're going to pay for more maintenance money. We're going to actually fill in the readiness drivers in advance so that we don't wind up where we really were at the end of the Cold War, which was with this massive force that wasn't being well supported. We have to build those things. And I think the VCNO in his testimony the other day brought this up. Hey, a 355 ship Navy is a much more expensive Navy across the board. That is not reason not to buy that Navy. That's a reason to describe, narrate, and advocate for that Navy more effectively.
Or you think it's being advocated as effectively because lawmakers seem to be getting the message and supporting the Navy?
I don't think it's being advocated effectively. I don't think that at all. I think what we're seeing is that the Navy got a good bit of money in 17, 18, and 19. But so did all the other services. It was a general, widespread defense increase. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of people saying, all right, we're finished with that, mission accomplished. I don't think that's the case. I think the Navy has an unremitting job to continue to demonstrate to its bankers on Capitol Hill and to its board of directors, the American people, what it does, why what it does is important to them, why what it does is worth their tax money. And I don't see that in a concerted way, and it's something I'd like to see more of in the future.
What form should that take then?
Essentially a campaign. Every flag officer in the United States Navy should be hitting the rubber chicken circuit and giving a speech to the Rotary Club, to the Kiwanis Club. This should be
Don't forget the Moose Lodge.
The Moose Lodge. Whoever wants to hear the message. One message, many voices. Just get them out as apostles of sea power. This isn't advocacy. This isn't we're better than the Army or the Air Force. This is what your Navy does for you. This is the return on your investment. Here are some of the challenges we have in carrying that forward. And I think the Secretary of the Navy needs to up his game. I think the CNO needs to up his game, and I think the flag officer community of the United States Navy need to up their game in this public communication strategy.
Well, Navy League's a great place to do it because it was founded in order to do just that, advocate American sea power. Brian McGrath of Ferrybridge Group, it's always an honor and pleasure, Brian, to talk to you, and hope you have a successful Navy League, and maybe we'll even have an after action with you at the very end to see how you graded all the messages you heard here.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Pleasure.